a little bit about that, and then we'll really get into the more core questions about what this is
Sure,
really about.
sure. So, my research and tracking and really looking at systemic white supremacy both comes from an academic and a personal perspective. My grandmother was African American, and my on one side, and my grandfather on another was Lebanese. So I am actually an octoroon, and when I was younger, because I'm quite a bit up there in age, I was basically called a high yellow girl, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody would come and touch my hair. Oh, it's soft. Like I would say, what, you expect your Brillo pad or something? So that's been a part of my life. And as things have changed in the culture in terms of who and what is recognized as
Hmm.
not white, I've become more someone who can walk out into the street and people basically take me for white. So that's essentially what has happened. But that doesn't mean I don't know who I am.
Right.
I'm not subject to the same things people of darker color skin are. I can walk into a store. There's not going to be any security that follows me. And essentially, you know, what happens for me or not for me is a choice based on how I identify. I was very close with my grandmother, and I've worked in the Black community my whole life. So that is a part of who I am, my identity. I don't necessarily identify as white, but that doesn't mean that I don't know that that's how the world sees me.
Hmm.
So there's that. I was mentored by somebody who probably should have been my dad and probably was in another life, who was African American and Muslim, who was basically with Malcolm X from the beginning, and then when he left the Nation of Islam until he was assassinated.
Hmm.
And that's who my mentor was, along with a few other Soulaan people who are basically from the 60s and had just so much knowledge to give away.
Hmm.
So I was very fortunate in that regard. And growing up, I read Malcolm X autobiography and Soulaan Eyes and all these other books, Black Like Me, not Black Like Me. What is that one? It's by this guy, Man-Child in the Promised Land. All of those kind of old books that you would say, oh, God, that's really going back. Well, yeah, I do go back. And so my perspective was very much from the point of view of Malcolm X to begin with already.
Yeah.
The fact that he had been with Malcolm just made the gel between us really, really work. So that's where that started. And throughout the research that I've done, when I did my master's in public policy, post genocide prevention and post-conflict reconstruction, I continued my research in white supremacy, but not of any one group, of the systemic white supremacy that is the framework of not just how this country is legally, but how it functions in reality.
Yeah.
So that whatever is on paper really doesn't see the light of day for anybody who's a Soulaan American, period. And for me, the best way I can sum that up is to say white supremacy is not a brick in the wall. It's not a policy. It's not a piece of legislation or a something in the Supreme Court ruling. It's the fucking mortar that holds everything together. That's what that is. And so that's what I continued to research and tap into, which also meant talking to a lot of white supremacists and getting what their take was, what they were doing, and following them on social media in all of the ways that they did that, things that they would post, and just tracking that as best I could, because, while the media is saying, oh, it's just a small few people of few Americans, I'm sitting there looking at all the chapters and all the organizations that are white supremacist organizations across the United States. And we're talking hundreds of organizations. And then of those organizations, we're talking 50 to 100 chapters each. So that is no small portion of America. And along with that, I tracked things like the white supremacist involvement from the police department to direct links between some of these organizations and to their, Facebook pages and Telegram, where they were posting all this. I feel like I probably was somebody who was literally like a drone pilot or in Intel who was watching all these, terrorist memes and videos, because that's what the content was. It was horrific. And so tracking that and seeing exactly where that goes and what their plans are and how they plan to implement stuff, both in cities and towns that they gravitate to for specific events and within their own communities.
Absolutely. And so who are some of your major Soulaan influences? You
I'm
would say
sorry?
some of your major Soulaan type of influences. I know you mentioned Malcolm X. Um,
Malcolm X is a big one. My mentor, I mean, I can't say anything without hearing his voice or his words come out of my mouth.
I know before you've mentioned Dr. Cress Wilson.
Oh, yeah. Well, Cress Welsing,
Hmm.
absolutely. The ISIS papers, Keys to the Colors.
Hmm.
Ivan Cervantes.
Oh yes. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Richard Wright.
Hmm.
Um, uh, all those. I mean, I could go back like
Yeah.
hundreds. We're talking books that were published before you were even a thought in your mother's mind, right? So, in some ways, I feel sort of out of step, but in other ways, these are classics. So,
These are
Bell
classics,
Hooks.
and these are actually no. I wanted you to elaborate on that because I know in our previous private conversation, you kind of surprised me when you said that some of those names, and I was like, oh, she like yeah, she's really knows what she's talking about. So these are things that um, even
Yes,
my
and so a lot of
generation,
Egyptology I've read,
yeah,
a lot of so for instance, and this crosses over into a lot of my metaphysical work that I've done all my life,
oh
right?
yeah,
So there's a
absolutely.
great, huge metaphysical tradition that comes out of Egypt and Africa as a whole.
Hmm.
So this all just intersects for me in every which way that you can imagine, including minoring in African studies in college. And the teacher, fortunately, I was fortunate enough that the teacher who taught that course that entire year had actually was a traveling professor who was instated for that year to teach that course from Africa. She was from Kenya.
Hmm.
So we looked at and a lot of things that most other teachers in America would not be able to present in terms of perspectives
Hmm.
and things that went on. We talked about everything from the decolonization of the Mau Mau uprisings to Jomo Kenyatta. I mean, just everything. I followed South Africa closely in the 90s, was a part of that whole anti-apartheid movement,
Hmm.
and actually got the privilege of seeing Nelson Mandela speak and Desmond Tutu. And this is all in San Francisco, right? Where everything happens. And so there's just been a long history for me of following all these leaders. And just
Yeah.
because I'm a Malcolm girl doesn't mean I didn't read Martin Luther King and some of these others. I'm a big fan of Rat Brown. I love his approach. I love the Black Panthers approach. I love all their social programs. It doesn't stop. Angela Davis, it just
Hmm.
everybody.
And then going back to Dr. Cresswell Wilson for a second, because you mentioned in the ISIS papers and how much of that was an influence, and a lot of my generation as well. We are much more astute to her teachings and her
Yes,
influence as well, thanks to people like Tariq Nasheed, who has
yes,
delved deep into her
yes.
history as well. So we have the utmost understanding and
Cress Welsing, I
mhm,
think for the most part, Cress Welsing and Frantz Fanon were
mhm,
the two most germane for me in terms of looking at the psychiatric and not psychiatric in terms of there's a mental health problem here. There is, but the definition between mental health and psychopathy and what it is that drives white consciousness and where they're trying to go with it. And so, yes, there's that underlying, DNA that she talks about, that drive to perpetuate the white race because any kind of taint means we're going to just be wiped out. And in all the rest that she talks about, but there's many other authors too that talk about this, that talk about the fact that any person who, as a person of color, who's Black, who's Soulaan American, is a threat to whiteness itself. And so at that point, we're talking far beyond any one individual or one piece of legislation. We're talking about, and this is what I see when I hear policemen say, "Oh, I was afraid for my life." What? Right? Because that's embedded in their reasoning. That's embedded in their perspective. That's embedded in everything they're about. And you can't necessarily say it's just the culture. I think it's embedded far more than that especially after generations of viewing Soulaan Americans like this, I think it's epigenetic to be point blank.
And just to transition into that, let's just go into some of the more important questions that we have been bestowed here.
Mulling over.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. So one of the questions I had in mind, I believe I sent to you. What impact would classify racism as a mental disorder have on public understanding and treatment of racial bias?
Okay, so this is a really complex question. First of all, I do not view white supremacy as, and I want to make the distinction between, we're talking about white supremacy because racism is the effect of white supremacy. White supremacy is the problem. So for me, white supremacy is basically a criminal mindset that is consistent with what we would call antisocial personality disorder with or without psychopathy. Most of the time it's with psychopathy. What I mean by that is when you treat another human being or view any group of people as less than human, and yourself as superior, you lack empathy. There's no sense of identifying with this other human being as a person. And so you're free to do whatever you want without conscience, without guilt, without regret, without remorse, no empathy, no nothing, just complete amorality. And so when we're talking about white supremacy, everybody can see behaviorally this is how white people behave. And really, the only way you can diagnose a psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder with psychopathy without is by behavior. It's not a mental illness like PTSD, even if we're going to say that's a mental illness, which is 90% of the time it's not. It's a normal response to abnormal circumstances. Depression, anxiety, it's nothing like that because people with depression and anxiety and PTSD still have ethics. They still have conscience. They still have guilt, remorse, whatever. So we're talking about criminal behavior that's classified in the DSM as a mental disorder, but really that diagnosis means criminal behavior that's unremitting because people lack empathy, conscience, guilt, remorse, and so forth. So the impact that would have if we were to classify that, and I want to make clear that this was not something I of myself just thought of, right? There's a whole rich history of Black psychiatrists and people beforehand talking to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, writing letters saying, we want racism. At the time, that's what they identified. I identified as white supremacy. We want racism put in the DSM as a psychopathy. And the American Psychiatric Association literally wrote them back saying word for word, because racism is a norm. It cannot be classified as a mental disorder. That's like saying, well, because you beat your wife and that's normal, we can't classify that as a mental disorder. Are you crazy? Well, the answer is yes. But it's also run by traditionally white psychiatrists and white physicians, and that's how it's been. And we've not been able to make any inroads with that. But I think the time is ripe at this point. And the impact would be also that if it's classified in the DSM as a quote unquote mental disorder, then you've also got something you can take to the courts. When something happens that someone is actually practicing in their behavior, white supremacy, right? Because I don't give a shit what you think about me. What you do is what counts. So that would also mean that it makes the grade for criminality, and there's some impact there. Secondly, when you've got that, then you've got room for medical professionals and Soulaan organizations that are based around people in medicine, in psychiatry, in psychology to say white supremacy is a public health crisis that we need to focus on. Because I remember when I was in school, and this went from when I was in school in the 70s all the way to when I got my doctorate that I just graduated from in 2016. The thing people would always say when you bring up racism in terms of therapy, well, you can't ask people if they're racist, right? This is an opinion. No, it's not an opinion. It's a behavior. Not only that, you're not supposed to like get in there and mess around with stuff that people don't have any distress over. Well, if you don't have any empathy for the other person, you're not going to be distressed about what you do. But what about the person impacted? What about not addressing the wrongs that they're doing to others? So, because that's been the stand in psychology, it's been very difficult to even get racism is part of the training other than looking at the victims and what the impact to victims. Well, that's nice, but if you don't take care of the aggressor, it's just going to keep happening, which is why you can't classify racism as PTSD because it's ongoing. PTSD by definition means it has stopped, and 6 months later, you're still having traumatic experiences as a result. It ain't ever stopped, so there is no PTSD here. There's ongoing trauma that's incurred daily.
One
Does that
thousand
answer the
percent.
question?
Absolutely, it does. And to speak on that, it's almost very relative as well when I think about the recent Metcalf and Carmelo Anthony situation,
Yes,
and the fact that you mentioned the APA, because I remember, with me also having a psychology background, I remember reading that Soulaan kids are 18 times more likely to be sentenced as adults, and that was coming
absolutely.
from the APA.
Absolutely. But they say nothing about why.
Yeah, they don't say
And
nothing
they
about
don't
why.
address the
Yeah.
cause. They just let it hang. And this is a thing that just I mean, talk about making steam come out of my ears and worse, right? This will send me out the block. So they make all kinds of statements because we know research wise what the impact is. And we know that Black Americans, Soulaan Americans, are 10 times more likely to be classified as behavior problems when kids versus having ADHD or a learning disorder. And as a neuropsychologist, I can testify to that because I literally pull them into my office to make sure they get the actual diagnostics they need versus, the school classifying these kids as behavior problems. And therein begins the whole slide into the system. And that is criminal as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. I remember even recently seeing someone did a study on a few kids, and a black child was involved, amongst with other white children. The teacher was They made sure to measure the eye contact between the teacher and the kids in the kindergarten, and the focus on the black children was always much more prevalent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so they made the study about the fact that young black Solon children are much more policed, and much
They're
more
expected to behave badly
they're expected to
because
behave
they
badly.
don't
Absolutely.
behave white.
Right. And then it comes to a point where you're constantly going back to the same system of schooling, and it gets to a point where it's almost aggravating. It's almost not
It
You're not
is.
getting the same experience as everyone else as
That's right.
well.
And their whole education is disrupted. And
Absolutely.
if it's not disrupted based on being identified as a behavior problem, it's disrupted because how would anybody go to school and basically sit there in a semi-anxious state trying to act the way that you're supposed to act so you don't get identified or targeted, knowing that you're going to be targeted anyway, and you still are able to take in what's being taught. So the impact of white supremacy and racism is insidious. You don't have to be targeted for it to have a profound impact.
Absolutely. Now, going back to the PTSD, I want to take a excerpt from the paper you've written. It says symptoms of PTSD experienced in genocide across generations have also become part of their ethnic cultures and are reinforced now by present day racism. So the question is, can you explain how symptoms of PTSD have been culturally embedded within Black American communities, if at all? And what are the long term risks if these issues remain untreated?
So I want to separate two things out. I want to separate the mental health and cultural impact in terms of behaviors and how Soulaan Americans live with this ongoing PTS or, you know, not post, but trauma syndrome versus the medical impact, because they're both profound, and in many ways they're also both embedded in the culture. So let's talk about the mental health impact first. First of all, we cannot measure the full impact or the legacy of enslavement or racism or white supremacy because it's ongoing. And it sets about within the culture two things: the defensive position and the resilience factor, which never gets talked about. So the defensive position is the obvious one. We all know, where your parents sit you down and tell you, you do not say anything. If the police come at you, don't do anything. I mean, it's basically, they tell you don't breathe in public if you're black. And if you are breathing in public when you're black, watch your back because they're coming for you. Because we all know that's true. So there are cultural behaviors that are passed on generation to generation based on the need to survive this killing death machine called white supremacy. That's one way it's carried on. Well, again, you start out being somewhat anxious because you're targeted from the time you get into school as being Soulaan American, especially if you're in a mixed race school. And you've got all different types of teachers that are going to treat you all different types of ways. So there's a level of anxiety that's already set and a level of hypervigilance that only comes with knowing that you are a target, whether at the moment you're targeted or you're waiting for it to happen, because everybody knows it will at some point or another. And then there's the setup for the years of how you're told and taught to behave should that occur. And the teacher says, "Hey, you're talking too loud, or you're doing this or that, or you're causing a problem, Marcus, go to the back." You're not free to say, "Hey, it wasn't me. He hit me." You're not free to say that. You just basically you have to say yes or no, because if you talk back, you're going to the principal's office, and at so many times it's going to be a problem. Somebody hits you or targets you or calls you names and you smack back. It's not the person who did it first. It's you that's going to end up with the problem. And it's not going to be just the principal gave you a talking to. Not unless you're in another Soulaan school with Soulaan teachers where there is an understanding of not only what goes on and constitutes culture between us, but also the hypervigilance and anxiety that Soulaan people starting from childhood live with, period. Which makes us a little bit more hair trigger. But then you want to talk about inhibition of responses. There's nobody on the planet that is able to inhibit those responses that any normal person would have in the face of some white person targeting them than Black Soulaan Americans, period. Because you have to in order to survive. So that is part of the legacy. The other part is the things that we see through the relationships with Black men and Black women, the difficulties that there exist within that ability to connect and have relationship. There's still the fear that CPS is going to come along and take your kids, because they do, at the drop of a hat. And all these other things. And, it doesn't matter how much education you have. It doesn't matter how much money you have. If you're Black, a Soulaan American, you will somehow, some way, the system is literally set up to incorporate you and take you in as part of the problem of America. So there's that. There's just so much behind that. So trauma is a huge thing for us, but so is resilience.
Right.
We have so many ways of impacting ourselves with resilience. The spiritual roots that you find in the Soulaan community are unlike anything else, anywhere else in the world. And I've made studies of religions forever. That's where I land, because that's where my roots are. It is the most complete, comprehensive understanding of spirituality and how to comport yourself in this life, which is also why you find more integrity in the Black community than you do in white people. It's just, and that's my experience, and I've been in both, right? You also find more compassion and willingness to open up to other people and new people and people that don't exactly look like you in the Soulaan community. You don't find that in the white community. The Soulaan community is unlike anything anywhere, and that's because of the unique and torturous history of Black folks in America. So that's what I can say there. Let's talk about the medical. The medical impact of generations of torture, enslavement, imprisonment, false police reporting, being targeted from the ground up, is essentially to raise your cortisol levels in the body. When cortisol levels are raised, insulin is suppressed. Okay, think of fight or flight. You're getting
Yep.
ready to fight and
You're
flee.
getting good.
And that's right, your digestive system shuts down.
Mm-hmm.
The insulin shuts down. You're getting ready to use all your energy to go to something. And when you come back down, or by the time you get to the place, and let's say this happens at 7 a.m. in the morning, by the time you get to the place where you've come down from that cortisol spike, it's 4 in the afternoon and you are starving. So what do? You reach for a candy bar. You reach for whatever is going to give you the instant energy because you are exhausted. You've exhausted your adrenaline at that point. And so part of this, think of what's going to happen now. You eat something that's sugar or starch based, and your insulin is not available to actually meet that sugar spike. Over time, this becomes insulin resistant diabetes. Over time, this starts, the stress of the central nervous system being hyped up and anxious becomes heart disease. Okay. And the whole lifestyle, the whole metabolic balance of your body is disturbed, such that there's high rates of things like diabetes, kidney disease, and other types of things when you look at this that are prevalent in the Soulaan community. Well, here's the answer to that, because we can't go around and measure all of that, although there's plenty of public health indicators in terms of ascribing what the problem is. So here's how you do that. I looked at the veteran population who's been exposed to combat most of the time, over and over. Their rates, because of the higher levels of cortisol in their systems, their rates of diabetes, kidney disease, heart disease, cancer, autoimmune, blah, 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 match the rates of elevated diabetes and kidney disease and heart disease in the Soulaan community. So what that tells us is, well, I can't say that's directly as a consequence of racism. What I can tell you is that the impact of racism medically and metabolically is the same as if you had been in combat several times. Okay. So now we're talking, that stress, PTSD, is toxic. It's deadly. And maybe not in the immediate minute, but over time. And that, by the way, alters your DNA. That's where the epigenetics comes in, and it's passed on to your children. So even if they weren't exposed to the same environment, we're just going to imagine for a minute that somehow that magically doesn't happen, they would still inherit the propensity for all those diseases to pop up with the normal vicissitudes and stresses in any one person's life, because that would be their body's pathway that was already laid out. Now, take that away and just imagine that you've got all that and you have a kid and they're continuously exposed to what you were exposed to. All those things are just gathering up more elevated cortisol in the system. That's how that goes. So that's the explanation. Essentially, when you look at these two groups of population, the one thing they share is elevated rates of these diseases, and they're both struggling with trauma. That's the primary factor. The other thing that we looked at when I look at the research, the most common, what we would call disorder that arises from trauma, is substance abuse, bar nothing. And I've worked in substance abuse since I was 26, or even before then. So substance abuse typically is treated as a standalone. But what we've learned with veterans and what the research tells us is, if you don't treat the PTSD, the substance abuse continues, because that's the medication that helps people manage the impact of trauma. When you treat PTSD, veterans essentially ease up on the addiction or the amount that they're drinking and using, because it's not needed anymore. Well, that's fine for them. They're no longer in combat. What about African Americans? What about Soulaan people, right? It's still going on. So the point of therapy is not to say, oh, well, that doesn't matter, you can go out and do something different. The whole point of therapy should hopefully be to increase your resilience factors and give you alternatives for how to deal with that trauma other than substance abuse. But it's 100 times more difficult when you're still in the combat type environment, period. As a result of substance abuse and trauma, the first things that happen are disrupted sleep, the emergence of anxiety and depression. And that we know from veterans, we know that from the African American Soulaan community. So these are the things where if I were going to number it, right, in terms of what is causal and then what are the effects. The cause is white supremacy. The effect is trauma, ongoing trauma. And effect number one is going to be, depression and substance abuse, then depression, anxiety, insomnia, just like that, and obesity. So all you have to do is take a look around us. And we've got tons of that going on in our community. On the other hand, we've also got a grassroots movement that has been ongoing since the beginning towards spiritual practices that help heal those wounds and give you some resilience factors. Because the truth is, we are not going to prevent white supremacy and the racism that goes with it, but we still got to learn how to live with it and try to have the healthiest and most productive, happy lives that we can. And that's all that therapy can give, because there's no way you're going to therapy away white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. You hitting hard now, right now. We cooking right now, Kate. This is the type of conversation I definitely wanted to bring forward. Staying true to some of that cortisol. I'm gonna kind of pivot to testosterone and
Mm-hmm.
reducing the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal.
Are you talking about the amygdala?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So what's the question again? I'm sorry.
That leading to the less active prefrontal cortex to the control of emotions, which leads to traits like anger or more expressed emotions in that sense. When we're talking about this control of emotion in this prefrontal context in connection to testosterone, what type of effects are we really seeing here, or how can we really um, balance out what's really happening here when we're seeing these traits of anger or expressed emotion?
Okay. So let's talk about the testosterone myth. There's a common misconception that testosterone or an excess of it produces road rage, right? Just anger that spikes and is out of control, 0 to 60, all of that shit. That is a myth. Okay. There is something called suppressed anger that one human being can only tolerate so much abuse for so long without getting pissed off. You can treat anybody like this, even an animal who loves you. And at some point, they're going to turn around and bite. Well, when Soulaan people finally have had enough, and you never know what day that's going to be, when that anger comes out, oh my God, he's crazy. He wants to kill me. He's blah, 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 blah. This is a normal response. Anger is a normal response to ongoing abuse that there is no respite from. I mean, you just can't, you're not going to find a human being where that's not true. So that's not necessarily the response of testosterone. There is some indication when you look at the testosterone levels for people in prison that are elevated who've committed violent crimes. But I got to tell you, you put anybody into a cage with a bunch of other people that have a propensity for violence, and people's testosterone are going to either go up because that's their defensive stance, or way down because they're trying to be submissive. One or the other. So testing people in prisons over time really doesn't give us any data. It just tells us what happens in prison. And that's mostly where that comes from. When you talk about testosterone, you're talking about, all kinds of things. So you mentioned the prefrontal cortex. Let's talk about the prefrontal cortex, because as a neuropsychologist, I can tell you the things that cause damage to the prefrontal cortex, which is where you find your reasoning skills, your ability to delay gratification, your ability to regulate your emotional conditions and spikes in emotion, your ability to look and see, that cop is really after me. I better just keep my mouth shut, even though you want to slug him because he's a damn white supremacist. That's where that kind of inhibition of behavior lives. The damage to it through things like fighting, gang violence, domestic violence, drug abuse, alcoholism, and alcoholism, all of that shit, 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 all police violence, right? Will lose. Let's talk about football, right? Football, all of that kind of stuff. Any hits to the head, particularly the area where the prefrontal cortex is and the whole frontal area of the brain, because that's where the executive functions are, is almost always going to produce an inability to control your anger and responses to emotion. And it's going to often cause a 0 to 60 response. We see this in sports figures. We see this in veterans. We see this in Soulaan people when they've reached the edge and the end. So very often when we're talking about somebody who spikes like that, we're talking about somebody with a brain injury. Far more so than somebody with elevated testosterone.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason, matter of fact, let me apologize because when I actually said, when I wrote down the amygdala, I forgot the G. So when I read it, the question now, I completely forgot
Don't
it.
worry about it. Don't listen. If you saw the way I
Um,
write, I have a hard time reading my own writing. Okay? Don't even worry about it. And I can't spell to save my life.
right. So the thing with me is, so not only am I reading the psychology of a lot of things, but I'm also reading a lot of things through NCBI when it comes to more things connected
Right,
to,
like neuroscience is
right.
huge in this area. And the problem for it, though, is we're
Hmm.
still looking at norms and standards based on white norms.
Right. Yeah.
Now, they say there's a multicultural smattering of people, but that still doesn't do us any good, because we need norms that are consistent for us to see where we're at, comparing it to white society, when basically we've got a society that is normed on culturally normative psychopathy. Doesn't do anybody any good who's got empathy and a conscience, because you've
So
got a whole different set of hormones and neural architecture going on there that isn't going on in other places.
absolutely, they made this connection when they tested animals in correlation to testosterone and low cortisol.
Yeah.
Um, and so we see some of that same social aggression. Is that something that we would explain through the epigenetic
So I
explanation as well?
can't, there's not enough data that I'm aware of to say
Hmm.
that. What I can say is, number one, PTSD proper is not heritable, meaning you do not inherit the neural architecture for that. You inherit a central nervous system response. PTSD is a relationally induced traumatic disorder, if you will. I don't like using that word, but I have to because that's the medical way that they're describing it. Psychopathy is heritable. That means you're inheriting the neural architecture and the lack of neural architecture where there should be some, and you're literally inheriting that. That is passed on genetically to children. So when we talk about epigenetics, once those epigenetics are set, meaning you've flipped those phenotypical switches on or created switches where there used to not be any, then you're talking about things that can be inherited. And when you're talking about a lack of empathy, you're talking about, missing pieces and missing morphology in the brain. And this is very well documented in terms of research. As a matter of fact, there's a fascinating research about this guy who was a doctor who was researching psychopathy, and he was putting psychopaths through, well-identified psychopaths, through fMRIs and MRIs to see what their brain morphology looked like. And at one point he got this idea, why don't I just put myself through one of these? Come to find out, he also registered as a psychopath on that spectrum based on what was absent in his brain, which he later self-disclosed to say, this answers a lot of questions for me. I've always had, my wife and kids have always had to tell me to tell them I love them. They've always had to tell me to do this or do that so that they know that I feel these things, because I basically have or when there's something's wrong with them, they have to basically tell me how to respond, because I have no sense of what to do and what's going on. I have my empathy is very low. And he talked about some other things, and it was fascinating, because it's not uncommon to find psychopaths and people on the psychopathic spectrum that are centered in positions of power. And obviously research in medicine is one of those places. Corporations and politicians are another. And then you talk about, culturally normative psychopathy as the white norm in white society, you're talking about people where that spectrum of DNA and spectrumy type of inheritance is spread across the entire population. We're talking 500-600 years of people, white people, treating Soulaan people like they're less than dirt and seeing them that way and actually believing that that's what it is. I would classify that as delusion, except at this point, it's basically they're inherited, they're limited. They are limited. That is the way you can understand this the best. They are limited in their ability to do that. That, however, does not mean there's no treatment available, but it's not the normal treatment as usual. Because if you empathize with somebody who's a psychopath, you're going to be his lunch.
Absolute. One of the things you went over as well in the paper, you said racism should be included as an antisocial personality disorder, or
So I had co-authors on that paper. If it was
okay, yeah, absolutely, you
if it
did,
was my paper and I had complete say-so,
right?
I would have said it was white supremacy, but I'm also the junior author. These are people that are 20, 30 years older than me, Soulaan Americans who've spent their lives in research, and this was their perspective, and I wasn't about to argue with them.
And the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that's what the DSM is. You want to break that down? I know we've been using that a lot. I just want to make sure the audience understands.
So yeah, the DSM, they came out with the first DSM. As a matter of fact, I have copies of every single one they ever issued in 1959, and it was a very small spiral bound notebook that a group of psychiatrists, white psychiatrists, got together and basically put together a formulary that outlined certain symptoms as commonly seen as those with particular disorders. So, for instance, depression, you always see sadness or extreme anger. You see low energy. You see, hopelessness, despair, that kind of stuff, right? And so they began to group symptoms and classify them as actually constituting a certain disorder or not. At the beginning, it was pretty, it was kind of loosey-goosey, but, we're starting. The second issue was a little bit thicker. Third issue, I think, was issued actually finally as a paperback or as a book. So it was thick enough by then. But we're also talking about things like LGBTQ, people, gender, being gay or lesbian was classified as a disorder. DSM-4 came out, and how they create the DSMs is a working group of psychiatrists who volunteer, and they're very often connected via stock or on the boards of pharmaceutical companies, which is why they come out with certain disorders and not others, because there's also an investment there that would be contradictory for any lawyer and they'd be thrown out of court. So the DSM becomes based on a working group. Maybe you've got a working group on anxiety. Maybe you've got a working group on neurodevelopmental disorders. Maybe you've got and so they gather material data from research and clinical report about what types of symptoms that people commonly see when they have these diagnoses. The problem is that most of us in clinical psychology and psychiatry, we all have a different perspective on what constitutes mental illness, because what shows up in our office does not comport with data and research. Sometimes you got to go digging. There are some basic main factors that often do, but there's an awful lot that don't. So what the DSM has become is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual based on the statistics of what psychiatrists and psychologists turn in to be counted via research or clinical as symptoms that cluster to make that particular diagnosis. Those are the ones that are accepted and repeated. Over time, that morphs and changes, both as culture changes and what's viewed as a disorder or a mental illness. For instance, LGBTQ got taken out of the DSM from the transition from the DSM-4 to 5, right? So that's no longer classified as a disorder or a sexual perversion. So this is a slow evolution, and it's tainted by a white cultural norm, white supremacy, and the investment in stocks, from everything from testing materials to pharmaceuticals that would be dispensed as a result of clustering a certain set of symptoms around a certain disorder.
Absolute. And then I know before I get to the hands, I'm gonna get to my buddy Talent for in a second. Um, I understand that, or maybe the audience doesn't understand yet, though. You did co-author a. How would you explain the paper as well?
So the
What's it called?
paper is it's a paper that looks at what happened to Native peoples in the South and North American continents, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the onset the of Europeans coming over basically to colonize and to dig for gold and all the rest of that. And looks at the transatlantic slave trade to look and see, does this meet the definition currently of the UN's definition
Mm-hmm.
of genocide? And yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
So then the problem here is that you cannot charge genocide for anything that occurred prior to 1940, I think it's 46, 47, when the Genocide Conventions, Ralph Lemkin wrote them and they were ratified. Actually, Ralph Lemkin and the US, which is just abhorrent given how we've treated it the last, since it was written. But since it was signed, you can't grandfather any previous genocide into that. So you can't charge genocide for anything that went before. That paper set up the foundation, at least for me, in terms of, yes, these occurrences, the wiping out of just ungodly numbers of Native peoples and the transatlantic slave trade absolutely constitutes genocide. And then the behaviors in America after that. But here's where you draw the line. Since that genocide convention was signed in 1946-47, there have been cases that have been, legislated now through the ICC, and there have been rulings about that. And with each ruling, we come to see what the court decides is genocide and what it doesn't, and why. Not every ruling they make is something I agree with, but I understand their legal mojo for why they've done it. This is why I think that we charged genocide in 56 by the Black Panthers and all these other organizations, didn't make it in terms of a legal paper because there wasn't enough court cases where we could see what was actually needed to prove intent, where we could see, because intent is not based on individual instances or even mass murders. That would be considered atrocity. So through the evolution of court cases, which is where my studies come in genocide, I've been able to see where we need to go and can we prove intent? And yes, we can. Can we prove that this is actually a slow genocide by policy and legislation? Yes, we can. But it takes a level of organization and people working together and understanding clearly what does and doesn't constitute it, compiling that research and presenting it to a lawyer that can take it to international court. One of the reasons I want to focus on making white supremacy a diagnostic and statistical manual disorder under psychopathy is because that also gives us a better standing to claim that this is a behavior that represents criminality, and these are the effects. These people well know it. They get stats year in, year out, 5 years in, 5 years out, every 10 years from public health indicators, mental health indicators, housing indicators, criminal justice indicators. They got every motherfucking statistic they can have up their wazoo, and they double down on the same to the same effect and worse. And guess what? That proves they know what's going on. And if they double down on it and they still get the same effect and worse, and they continue to do that same behavior, that's intent. The court recognizes behavior once knowledge is gained as intent. So yes, we can. And you cannot charge genocide without being able to prove intent. That must be proven first. So that paper is the precursor to the one I hope to write.
Yep.
And it lays the groundwork for why these two events for African Soulaan Americans and Native peoples constitute genocide even prior to the genocide conventions.
Absolute. Just to be clear, me and Kate, we're looking to really push this through to the UN. And if it's anybody who is legitimate and able to help us get that and push that along, we would greatly appreciate it. Go ahead, Talent.
this isn't anything I can do myself. We need a group
Yes,
of people.
absolutely. Go ahead, Talent.
Peace and love, peace and love. Definitely shout out to you, host and co-host. I mean, this is like my thesis paper. I would raise it further and say, and those findings disqualify white, I would say, white superiority, ownership, and or more white people in positions of power and authority over black people, like permanently disqualified, right? Because once you connect a behavior that has been deemed normative, even though the normative behavior has harmful effects on a said group of people, and you do not do anything to remedy that situation, you're basically allowing those people to slowly die out, and be complicit to it. So what's being said is really important, and I've always, thought about it when I came across Alvin Toussaint, who in 1969 went to the APA and was saying,
Yes.
we need to get extreme bigotry,
Yes.
authoritarianism, right?
That's who I quoted. Yep.
Yep.
That's exactly who I quoted.
And a response back from the APA based on what was like the 1950s study from the North and the South, and said this is normative behavior, right? It would
Yes,
have it
exactly.
deviate. So it's like, because the majority of white people are racist, it's not they're not crazy. It's just their behavior, right? So
Yeah.
the complicit aspect of that. And I give you another one. E. Franklin Frazier back in the early
Mm-hmm.
19. He also went in to get into like the pathology, like like this concept of whiteness and the extreme, functionality of it that has been brutal in the Western Hemisphere. Definitely exhibits some sort of, psychotic behavior. So I've always, when I started to put it together in that standpoint and understand it from that framework, understood that we are up against a system that is psychotic in its nature because it
Yes.
has deemed us lesser than, right? We see it.
It's not psychotic.
Yeah.
It's not psychotic. These
Okay.
people know what they're doing.
Hmm.
They know it's wrong, and they do it anyway.
Anyway, right? And we see it playing out even in like the Carmelo Anthony situation. But yeah, I support this space. Hit me on the back channel. Y'all can mention the Proxmire Act of 1989, which basically codified the Genocide Convention in United States law. And that was signed by Joe Biden when he was Senator of Delaware. So that's another way to look at it. It could also be looked at through the Department of Justice, the DOJ, and getting them to do an actual federal commission similar to like the Kerner Commission, where they basically study us, under the links of genocide and pull wild disparity studies to showcase where our social indicators are. And the information is there, and that could be coupled with what's being said on the stage around these court cases and just kind of like the history as it's been implemented in law. So you put that with the disparity studies, you add the psychological part of that's genocide, I would argue not segregation but voluntary association, because they have a behavior innately
Yes.
that's been displayed that makes them unsafe around us. So it should be like, you got to get a certificate, you got to prove that you've rid yourself of necrophobia. Like it should be one of those things where you got to take a certain test and prove that you're safe around said group of people. Especially, and I'm gonna here when you want to add the epigenetic aspect of it and the lack of humanity being shown and empathy shown. So you just have a society that continues to grow more angry and hateful against other people. So yeah, I support it all.
Absolute. Thank you, Talent. Appreciate it every single time he comes to the space. Absolute. Kate, you had any response to that before I get to Cash?
So for me, this is just for me. I don't see trying to adjudicate this through any U.S. channels and institutions as being productive. The only hope that I have is that the UN accepts the brief once it's written and or looks at it through many of its task forces, and at the very least present some kind of reprimand to the US about what's been going on, because I do not in my wildest dreams think we're going to get it through the ICC because of the power that the US holds, not just because of the purse strings, but because of its, the foot it's got on the scale of the permanent five in the Security Council, and all kinds of other things, and the fact that we are not even a member of the ICC, which you got to sign on for. The rebuke that would come from the UN would be sufficient enough to at least pause, it be cause for pause. Do I think that's going to accomplish everything that I want in my wildest dreams? No. But this is a stepping stone to getting this into some place and some form where at some point action can be taken. And if it's ever adjudicated, reparations can be a part of what they would call the restoration or restitution of equality. And that would have to be constructed by Soulaan people in terms of what the needs are in their community, absent of any white input about what they consider to be normal and what they consider everybody else should have lived with. And at that point, the UN, or what I would hope would happen, would be that part of the oversight of America correcting its absolute abhorrent behavior would be the implementation of this stuff. We have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Greensboro, North Carolina. We've got individual communities in just like spot checks throughout the United States that are doing individual work in terms of the descendants of slaveholders getting together with the descendants of those enslaved and doing some kind of, conversation and recognizing the harms done and the guilt and all. My question is, what comes out of that? What do you do if you're a descendant of slaveholders? You've still been living on the legacy largesse of everything that went on before. So what are you going to do with your life? Because at that point, reconciliation requires action. Reconciliation and reparations are a verb. So if you're going to get together and do that whole touchy-feely, yeah, we all feel good now, we understand each other, blah, 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 what are you going to do about it if you understand? Because if you're not doing that, I'm not sitting down to talk to you, because that's a waste of my time and breath. It's that simple. So when we think about adjudicating this through anything, we'd have to get something through the UN with some kind of remarks before America as a nation may take that seriously. I don't imagine anything I have on my mind here is going to change everything, but I see that as the one open door left and the only open door left as a way to do something. Other than that, I'm basically throwing my hands up, because this is an epigenetic epidemic. We talk about psychopathy as a spectrum. Well, you're going to, Mendelian genetics, you have 4 kids, only one of them is not going to be on that spectrum. So when you look at voting statistics and you see, based on white people, 75% of them vote GOP and racist shit all the time. And maybe 1/4, if we're lucky, of white people don't. That's it. And right there is my thesis about epigenetics and how people are geared and what they're going to do. And they give you all kinds of reasons and excuses. That's meaningless. We all know what the truth is.
Absolute. Cash, you wanted to chime in?
Peace. Yeah, fascinating conversation. I don't say it often either. Peace, Maroc. And nice to meet you, Dr. Kate Shaw.
Nice to meet you, too.
Much respect. I consider myself a reparationist, but I tell people you should trust half what I say I spend on my head. First, because I'm a breakdancer. First, I wanted to mention that I think this is a very relevant conversation, because as reparationists, many of us don't really think about. I mean, I got to see a YouTube video, in fact, that showed interviews from white folks that were still around from when the Rosewood Massacre happened just outside of Gainesville, Florida.
Yes.
These white folks had no empathy in their conversation or in their eyes. Now we're looking at video as well as photo evidence of white folks who pulled their children out of school during desegregation times. In fact, Ruby Bridges is still alive and has a Twitter page, right? And I consider myself a chess player. So it's very important to understand the mind of your opponent, right? I even looked at the 48 Laws of Power, which mentions that you can't appeal to someone's empathy or gratitude. You must appeal to their self-interest. So with that in mind, I kind of wanted to ask just a bit of a question. What's going on in Palestine right now? I heard that they've been told to, they have 24 hours to upend and constantly move themselves. and that there are 5 forms of genocide in the United Nations, and one of them is forced migration. And I wondered if there's a case that we can make based off of the Great Migration, or some might argue the Great Escape. And then I had one more question that's a bit more controversial, but I wanted to start with that, if I may. Thank you for letting me ask my question.
I love your question. First of all, what's going on in Palestine is not separate from what's going on in America. We like to think it is, or the way people like to think it is, but it's not. It's just an extension of the same by other means. So what's going on in Palestine is genocide. It has been from the start because it was going on. It was an ongoing genocide before October 7th. And as somebody who's studied that area as part of my genocide studies, I already knew October 7th happened. I know that this is the most wired goddamn place in the world. There's no way anything happened without Israel knowing it. And I said literally on October 8th, this was an inside job and allowed to happen. And it's been proven right. Everybody told me I was crazy. They tell me that all the time. I don't care, because it is. That's number one. Number two, yes, that's one of the 5 criteria. And so let me just, for those of you who haven't read the Genocide Conventions, and I would encourage all of you guys to go to the UN website and look at the Genocide Conventions. They're not that long, but particularly pay attention to Section 2, the preamble to it, where it describes what intent means, and then the 5 conditions that represent genocide. So the preamble about intent means that you must establish that whatever has occurred was done purposely and with knowledge, right? Knowledge of forethought. So that must be established. That's number one. Number two, the criteria, or the 5 crimes of genocide, right? You only have to meet criteria for having perpetrated one of those crimes in order to be prosecuted for genocide. Okay? So establish intent and one of those 5 crimes. And they are the killing of and targeting the killing of a certain group that has been targeted in mass, and the attempt to eradicate or literally get rid of the entire population in whole or in part. Okay. The second one is essentially so that we're talking about killing of members, right, of a particular group in an attempt to rid yourselves of that in that group, causing them serious bodily harm or mental harm. That's a hard one to prove, so I would stick with bodily harm, because we're going to get a lot farther, and that's plenty provable. Imposing living conditions intended to destroy a group. Preventing births, forcibly transferring children out of the group. Victims are targeted because of their real or perceived membership of a group, not randomly. The convention further criminalizes complicity, the attempt or incitement of its commission, which pulls in the media, by the way, which is why certain medias have been prosecuted as and held responsible as being complicit in genocides. Rwanda is a great case, and so is Bosnia-Herzegovina. Member states are prohibited from engaging in genocide, and get this, everyone who signed the Genocide Convention, every single nation, is obligated to report if it is even suspected that genocide is ongoing or occurring in any other nation. That means charges can be brought by Scotland, Rwanda, right? Saudi Arabia. Anybody who signed can bring those charges. And all perpetrators, that means everyone responsible, because this is a charge. When you charge genocide, you're basically charging the government of that nation with a mechanized, weaponized mechanism that literally is aimed at destroying a particular group. It's not about one incident, one individual, or even a particular corporation. This has to be something that the government is actually involved in perpetrating at most levels, because it wouldn't happen if it didn't. And all those people who say, well, we're just still working for the government because, somebody's got to do it. At some point, you've got to sit down and ask yourself, what the fuck are you helping come into being here? Because just going along because you want to make sure everything's going right doesn't cut it. And it won't cut it. It didn't cut it in Nuremberg, and it won't cut it after.
Absolute.
And,
Oh, go ahead, okay, Shakash, go ahead.
Yeah, and I appreciate the
Did I answer your question?
yes, ma'am, definitely. But
You had another one? I love controversial stuff.
yeah, it's a little bit crazy, so you might want to sit with it for a moment, or maybe it's a rhetorical. Um, I was looking at, and I've been listening to conversations amongst Soulaan Americans who are frustrated with, the idea that Pan-Africanism, or that all peoples, from Africa should kind of like support each other in fighting global white supremacy. That Black Americans marched to end apartheid in South Africa, right? Most
Mm-hmm.
recently, right, 1994 and stuff. I even know the
Mm-hmm.
name Nelson Mandela. He's seen as a hero in our community. But
Yep.
it sounds like, I don't know if it was the ANC or if there was their prime minister, but she went to the United Nations recently to hold Israel accountable for their
Yep.
acts of genocide.
Yep. Yes, Pandora.
Yeah, which I would argue is righteous. However, I feel like in a Pan-African spirit, they would have supported Black Americans who are surviving a genocide, as you're illustrating, right? Sonia Massey, so on and so forth. And so, not just being facetious, right? As a thought experiment. And one more thing is that when she went to the United Nations, they told her in private that the United Nations isn't to hold European nations accountable, but to hold African nations accountable.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that's kind of
Yes.
its history, right? Or maybe I suppose it's subversive history. So here's my question ultimately, with all that context out of the way. Is it feasible for Black Americans to weaponize the American government at the United Nations to hold African nations accountable, West African ones, specifically chieftains and tribes, for their role in slavery, with resources and land allotments that they would owe Black Americans? Could we weaponize, because right now, in my understanding, the United Nations, and there's a top five and all that, trying to hold America accountable at the World Court isn't as powerful, but as a divide and conquer strategy ultimately. So does that sound crazy?
No, but I'm going to give you some legal binding mumbo jumbo, which basically is the state of things. And then I'm going to address, because you got a lot of questions. You covered great stuff. I love where your head is at and where you're going. So first of all, to answer your last question first, no, you cannot hold African nations accountable. That existed, whatever happened occurred prior to the signing of the genocide conventions. And because the genocide conventions clearly state, if you read them, particularly the preamble in the first section, that no prior events that may or may not constitute genocide can be prosecuted under these conventions. They have to be prosecuted based on behaviors and occurrences from here on forward. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, essentially what in the last question you asked was, can we hold these people accountable? These people are generations away from that. And in Africa, they may stand up for Palestine, but the thing is, there's been no, other than George Floyd, whose brother took his case to the UN, and I watched that very closely because they did come out and say something, just not through the ICC. But there's been nothing from, to date that has met the criteria in terms of the way the brief is written to prove intent and to show, based on publicly available statistics of indicators across all measures that you can have, that genocide by policy, which is what you would be considered passive genocide versus an active genocide. So an active genocide is what's occurring in Palestine. A passive genocide of Soulaan Americans is what's occurring today and has been from time to beginning. Until they can't get another dollar out of your body, they're going to keep you alive, but only to do that. And so the impact of white supremacy, the way it's framed, and the policies and legislation that has come about as a result from both parties. I don't care who you want to talk about. It's both parties. So either one sat down and let the other one be the bad guy, or the other one just said, oh, it's incremental change. Well, tell me that you're going to a domestic victim's house and saying, well, we're going to talk to the husband about incremental change. Okay, that's bullshit. So here we have to present a brief that is at least held to have merit. Then other African nations, in terms of Pan-Africanism, and other nations can sign on. So notice when Minister Pander submitted and her staff submitted that brief to the UN, other nations signed on to it. They didn't generate it, but other nations signed on to it. Some immediately and some a little bit, slower terms. So at that point, gathering all those nations from which you were stolen to sign on to this would be absolutely appropriate and should occur. Does that answer some of what you said?
Yes, ma'am. And so you're saying that they're charging genocide from 1946 on.
No, they're charging genocide for Palestine, right? They charge genocide for Palestine based on what occurred after October 7th.
Yeah, but you're
and
saying
based on what's ongoing.
But we can't go before 1946, right?
Right.
Okay.
So it's like any other legal precedent, right? When a precedent is set, you cannot go back and charge what the new precedent is in terms of what qualifies for a crime. You cannot go back and charge people with that crime in prior spaces for having perpetrated that, because it wasn't then decided it was a crime. So the same thing occurs in the ICC with the acceptance of most treaties through the UN. Now, when you talk about, what was the second part I was going to say? It just flew away. When you talk about the getting of getting this brief through because of the United States has such a heavy hand in the UN and how it runs, obviously, as we've seen, that's going to be an issue. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. And even if all I do at the end of my life is just submit the goddamn brief, whether it's looked at or not, somebody else has a framework they can build on. That's what I care about. Yes, I want it to do something, but if it doesn't, does it advance what it is we're trying to do? That's the question I ask myself. Because if that's the purpose and that's the aim, then it is worth the effort.
Absolute. I'm going to start to wrap this up because this is a podcast and I got a lot of editing to do. I am going to get to Jubilee. Go ahead, Jubilee.
Yo, what's up? I'm glad you can have the space, and sorry about that. I'm just getting off not too long ago, so I missed part of it, but I'll be sure to circle back around. But yeah, I just really want to shout out to you and thank you to Dr. Shaw for this opportunity for us to really discuss it, because the way I see it is this is, even though this is focused on Soulaan people or Black Americans, this does connect to a bigger human issue, and I see it as a call to understand human systems and behaviors, especially, when it comes to the cruelty and, the domination that's forced upon people. And there's potential risk, of course, and I think especially in this kind of like multicultural landscape that we live in, especially for Black Americans, we have a very unique position. So there's kind of like a risk of possible universalization, so to reduce this from being just just another humanitarian crisis, which it is, of course. We kind of want to have some kind of draw on some things like epigenetics and culture and stuff. And one thing I wanted to bring up too was when it comes to culture, because that's one of my personal focuses that I'm kind of interested in. So when people hear genocide, they think of like, kind of like physical bodies, but I see it as something deeper than that. So like when our music is stolen and repackaged, spiritual systems are mocked or watered down, or anything like that, it's not just theft, it's kind of like a cultural deletion. So when I was reading through when I was kind of doing some research and, Maroc had kind of hit me to some stuff, I made a note that I kind of wanted to add that cultural appropriation and erasure or cultural theft or whatever you want to call it, that could also be considered genocide because it's Article 2E in United Nations Convention, of crimes of genocide. It says that forcibly transferring children of the group to another group is considered genocide. So there is a little more nuanced than the surface, of course, but we have plenty of examples of where we kind of see it as kind of like a body snatcher thing to us. Then also from the epigenetic side, I wanted to bring up. Wait, what was it? I had a note here. Well, yeah, I think you guys kind of went over it, but um, just the when it comes to the epigenetics of things, I think sometimes due to the history of and the racialization of Black Americans, it becomes a medical issue too because we get racialized and overlooked, and even when it comes to just education, I've had debates with people who want to kind of, and Maroc has been there where we go back and forth about genetic studies and things, and you look at the studies and the data sets just don't justify the narratives. So all of that stuff is kind of like collapsed and nested within each other. And when it comes to epigenetics, it lives in the body. It's in the subconscious. So I have a lot more to say, but I just want to say I appreciate the space and the focus.
Can I just respond to that for a minute? Because I love where you're coming from. And I just want to make it clear to everybody, there are a lot of things that could fit for genocide here, academically and lived experience that do. My focus is the way the ICC has adjudicated cases brought before it that charge genocide and why it has ruled against it or for it. Because you're not going to find an academician who's basically going to agree on any one thing or another, but it's the courts that count. And so for me, I'm focusing on what I can prove that actually destroys a group, that targets a group, that takes children. So, for instance, selling children off happened before the genocide conventions were signed. However, CPS and the targeting of Black families, Soulaan families, for removing children and the difficulty it is to get them back, and all the subsequent things that occur as a result, the multiple mental health and health indicators, criminal indicators, housing indicators, all that stuff compiled from 1956 on, right? Or you can say from the time the Civil Rights Acts were passed, where it was written on paper that everybody got equal access. The public health indicators, time after time after time, year after year, have been indicating that the legislation and the policies passed by U.S. government has a detrimental effect on the Soulaan community. And what do? Do they ease up on it? No, they all double down. That's intent. And the destruction of that. Let's talk about crack cocaine, right? It literally destroyed a whole generation that broke the chain from the 1960s and all the wisdom and the people that came out of that did not get passed down then, right? In the way that we would have liked. So, and yes, there was a resurgence in the 90s and people are struggling with it now. But I don't see too many of us from the 60s who are passing that knowledge on, who are passing that spiritual wisdom on, who are doing any of that. And I'm talking about people my generation and older. I don't see us out there. And these young people need that. So the responsibility for what constitutes a legal brief versus what you could potentially sue corporate media or record companies for in terms of the appropriation of Soulaan music, right? That's a separate issue that possibly could be adjudicated through the courts at some point. I don't know that you get anywhere at this point other than in individual cases. But in terms of reparations, hell yes, that should be documented. So all the things that you talk about absolutely should be a part of what is made as recompense for reparations to the Soulaan community as part of the after effect of reconciliation of the things that need to be done to correct for those wrongs and the legacy of them that every one of us in this community continues to live with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I wanted to actually add real quick too, because you just made me think of something else. I also want to talk about the mimetic effect, where we hear about the word meme, right? Where we think
Mm-hmm.
of just kind of like a political picture or something that's a reflection
Right.
of pop culture or whatever. But a meme it's a unit of cultural.
It's a information. It's a transfer of knowledge.
Exactly. So when we talk about the idea of racism and building your logic and basing your behaviors based on the logic of racism, that is definitely, it should be considered abnormal. But since it's been since it's been what's the word, mimetically passed down, it's you know what I mean, it's considered normal. So racism isn't just a social issue, it's a psychological distortion, and it
So,
reflects a true mental imbalance. You know what I'm saying? That
yeah.
that
So
it pretty much
nobody,
misreads human indifference.
you can
So
never say that somebody who hates as a state of being any group or people is normal. The
exactly.
state of
Yep.
hate is one of complete and extreme imbalance. But let me tell you, you can think whatever you want about me, but it is your behavior that is criminal, that puts Soulaan Americans in the position and keeps them there by maintaining, whether it is I didn't do it, so I don't have to do anything about it with my head down, to actually taking action to suppress and oppress. Any of those behaviors constitute that. But for when you talk about memes, what comes to mind for me is Gadamer's understanding of hermeneutics, which is the transfer of cultural knowledge within the words that we use. Pictures can be a part of that too. But you're absolutely right, that gets passed down. And that's why I do not talk about racism. I talk about white supremacy. Racism is the effect of white supremacy. The disease is white supremacy. And that's what I want classified as psychopathy.
Right, and I just wanted to say too, just one more thing in relation to the idea of memes, to really bring it together. Even the belief that human nature is violent, and then scarcity is inevitable. All of those are echoes of a history where those things may have rang true, but they, that shouldn't be how humanity is characterized. So
Have you ever worked with people who are substance abusers, particularly alcoholics?
yes,
So you know what the alcoholic mind is like, right?
right,
The
yep.
ism in the alcoholic mind. Guess what white people have had as a staple for water for centuries in Europe? Because the waters in Europe were poisoned. They drank mead of different strengths and dilutions, but mead was what they drank over generations. These people have an alcoholic mind. And if you look at the way they lived, the way they think, and how they
And it
behave,
became embedded in culture. Yep.
no, it's the epigenetic result. They have poisoned themselves. They have poisoned their DNA. They have poisoned their neural architecture. You cannot treat people sadistically. Sadomsexual was so much a part of the enslavement of other people. And so when you treat any human being with sadistically and gain pleasure out of that, you are altering your neural architecture. And if that's what you get pleasure out of, and I would argue that that is the main reason people want the freedom to be white supremacist, because they want the freedom to be sadistic and literally make people afraid and torture them and all kinds of. These are people who are criminally psychopaths, and that's a spectrum. So not everybody's Dexter, but we are talking about people whose brains are so altered. The fact that we use their norms is frightening as fuck.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we cooking. Go ahead, Soulaan D, last question of the night.
It's more a question or more statement than a
Okay, okay.
question. So I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, just learning from you and then just witnessing pretty much, like you said, the memes, these comments for the last few days. I've been kind of doing the study on purpose. So pretty much after seeing all this and reviewing repeating patterns of social engagement and public discourse, I come to a clear conclusion. So what is often directed at Soulaan people, it's not just historical denial, it's racialization, commodification, dehumanization, and division from every direction, such
Yep.
as white society. They demand we forget or assassinate, like you said, while rewriting the past or raise accountability. Often East Asian groups, they benefit from proximity to whiteness, yet remain largely silent and complicit when
Yep.
state or social violence affects us. And they also economically crippled us by taking a lot of stuff that we used to partake and even credit, such as a dry cleaning business and a hair care company. And then specifically West African groups, even though the social discourse the last, I think, week, we went back and forth with South Africans, but they often project this quote unquote global pan African $5 African unity while mocking our ethnic group, claiming our cultural creations, or refusing to acknowledge the distinct trauma that we carry. And this pattern isn't limited to just these groups. Anyone who tries to dilute our identity, repurpose our culture, or speak over us contributes to the same inhumane cycle. That's what I'm bringing up now. I'm bringing up they want to ethnicize us, they treat us inhumane, and they're very divisive. What's called unity too often means silencing so long truth for the comfort of others. So let me be clear. Clear. Solo identity really is not up to debate. It deserves protection, identity, recognition, not erasure, gaslight, exploitation like every other human on this earth. We're not a subcategory. We didn't get anything from everybody else. We're not a global black placeholder or a resource to extract from. We are human, and that's where we're drawing the line here. And then what Solon people, um, what we're also dealing with, instead of I'm calling it racism, it's just like you said, I'm just calling it super specific anti-black American or anti-Solon American bigotry, rooted in the system of iniquity, aka white supremacy, and is often carried out by and internalized by multiple groups all across the planet. Um, and I'll talk about the racialization. So, racialization of solar identity that I've been noticing is reducing our lineage to just a global African people, or if you want to say black, while denying our specificity. The commodification of our culture, our pain, our language. This is not like I heard, oh, English is not your first language. So many times our style, they saying we got style somewhere else. Our innovation, are consumed and never respected. Again, the dehumanization, where our struggles are often mocked. Our trauma is often mocked. It's
Yep.
often used as content or contrast. And then the constant divisiveness that's opposed onto us. When we assert our unique experience, we're labeled as separatists, we're labeled as hate group, while others are freely gatekeep, exclude, or appropriate.
Yep.
So for me, I'm not using racism as a loosely term anymore. It's very too broad. Um, what we're dealing with is a target persistence and institutional white supremacist anti-Solon hostility, weaponized globally and justified due to systems, again, through white supremacy. So I'm not speaking through a emotional standpoint. I'm speaking to your standpoint, a neuro, psychological, social, and structural. And we will no longer suffer it for any comfort. So I'm going to land my plane there.
Yes, absolute. Kay, you had any add a response to that before we wrap up?
No, I mean, there's nothing to disagree
Yeah,
with.
absolute.
In terms of what we're talking about when we talk about psychopathy,
Mhm.
those kinds of things can be included in terms of the psychopathy of white supremacy. as part of what we see as manifest behavior. It doesn't all fit into a legal brief, but as much as we can fit that in, that's what will be there in terms of will it create or generate legal merit? That's the only thing I'm worried about there. The DSM is something different. You can absolutely talk about the appropriation of culture and the money, the legacy largesse that white people have and continue to generate from the bodies of Black Americans. And I'm not focused on any other group except for Soulaan Americans, period. Because the intersectionality that, that's bullshit. There is no shared experience with any other group other than, yes, there are disabled people, there are, people with all kinds of stuff that you can say is intersectional. But really, is being Soulaan that's disabled really intersectional with other people that are disabled that do not have a Soulaan experience? I don't think so, because their disabled experience is nowhere near what it is for a Soulaan individual who is disabled. So intersectionality only goes so far, and unfortunately, it waters everything down.
Yep.
And I am not about that.
Yep. Absolute. So we will have Kate in future podcasts. This has been. I hope everyone learned something here. I'm sure they have. Absolutely.
I love all the questions. Thank you guys for coming. And you can ask me any questions. DM me. My DMs are always open. And I'm full of vim and vinegar and spit and all the rest of that. I'm going to preach, right? You ask me the question, I'm going to preach. But it's just because that's where I'm coming from. It's where I've always come from. That's what you're going to get from me.
Absolute. So yes, we do appreciate you, Kate. She has agreed to come onto the podcast more often. Isn't that right, Kate?
Yes, right.
I just wanted to make sure I wasn't forcing that. So yes,
No.
we become great friends. We've had quite a few private conversations, so we want to make sure everything we are saying here on the podcast and going forward is going to be aligned with the We Charge Genocide and other projects possibly as well going forward to bring upliftment to the Soulaan community. Also check out the Soulaan podcast by Maroc Oris and the Soulaan Guide, in which we also break down our autochthonous claim as well to America. Thank you so much for coming by, you guys. I appreciate everyone for coming by. Salute. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. Wonderful.